Tonight I'm going to talk about erectile dysfunction, which is a topic really that probably was never really discussed very much until maybe about 30 years ago. And it's a topic that hasn't been discussed largely because the people who experienced it felt embarrassed, ashamed, thought they were the only one experiencing it, and they felt they couldn't speak about it to anybody. But that's all changed in the last 30 years or so, at least in many, many parts of the world, but not certainly in all parts of the world. Okay, so when we talk about erectile dysfunction, which is also known as impotence. Erectile dysfunction is the term that's most commonly used now in the medical establishment and also among psychologists. It's important to define it. And probably the most useful way of defining it is simply to say one is suffering from erectile dysfunction if one cannot have an erection, a full, firm, hard erection, and sustain that erection for as long as they would like to for the purpose of sexual activity. Okay. Now, there's a certain general nature to that definition, and of course there are qualifiers. So that if somebody wants to have a firm erection that lasts for 24 hours, they're probably not going to be able to do that. Okay, I think it's fair to say that's not going to happen on this planet. But if someone is not able to do that, I wouldn't say they're suffering from erectile dysfunction. They're suffering from exaggerated expectations about the human body. Also, if one has an erection and ejaculates and wants to have another erection immediately, but is not able to, I would not say that they have erectile dysfunction. Depending on how old people are, you can have an erection, an ejaculation when you're, let's say, a teenager, and you can perhaps get another erection within a matter of minutes. If you're 85 years of age, you may be able to have an erection, but it may be every 2 or 3 days. Okay, so everybody's situation is somewhat unique, and also if we're talking about sexual activity, we also have to recognize that sexual activity involves another person, the sexual partner, the spouse, and what they want, what their expectations are, also affects whether people are performing in an adequate way or not. So that the role of a professional, when somebody comes to a professional with this kind of problem, is to learn the particular details of that person's situation. And it may well be that they may feel they're suffering from a problem, but once all the details have come out about the circumstances, it may turn out that they are suffering more from unrealistic expectations. What are the realistic expectations in terms of an erection? Well, we know that I mentioned the fact that having an erection that lasts for hours and hours and hours and hours is an unrealistic expectation. But certainly having an erection that lasts for 3, 4, 5 minutes is not an unrealistic expectation at all. A totally healthy human male can have erections well until their 80s. However, as I said before, if one is in one's 80s, there may be a significant amount of time that has to elapse before one can have a second erection after having a first erection and ejaculating. Okay, so that's very important to know. But we also know that there are certain health conditions that can affect the ability to have an erection and sustain an erection long enough to engage in sexual intercourse. And as people age, as they get particularly over 50, over 60, over 70, there's a greater and greater likelihood that they're going to have one of the medical conditions that seems to have an impact on erectile functioning. Heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes are three of the most common medical conditions that can make it difficult for people to have reliable erections for as long as they would like to. And also, unfortunately, while there are medications that can help people address these particular medical problems, some of them, particularly medications for high blood pressure as well as heart disease and diabetes, can have side effects that make it difficult. There are also many other medications that can have side effects that affect sexual functioning. And if somebody is on a medication and they start to experience this problem, they should check to see whether in fact they're taking a medication that is problematic way, and whether that medication could be substituted, another medication can be substituted for it, or perhaps the dosage can be adjusted in some kind of way. Because the higher the dosage one takes of any medication, the more likely they are to have a side effect. Okay, but today we're not going to be, although it's important to mention the medical aspects, medical causes of erectile dysfunction, today we're going to focus on the psychological ones. But before that, I think it's important to discuss the question of how significant is this problem, and how widespread is it? Because again, this is an issue that people have not talked about up until relatively recently. And even now, it's very difficult to get a completely accurate estimate of the proportion of the male population throughout the world that suffers from this problem either occasionally or chronically, permanently, more or less. Most of the research has been done in the last few decades, and most of it has been done either in the United States or Europe. But of course, European and American males are biologically no different than males from anywhere around the world, and so it's not unreasonable to think that, at least from the medical point of view, the figures we find in the research that we do have might not be rough equivalents of what you might find if you got information from people all around the world. Now, the other limitation of research is that it's voluntary. People have to be willing to talk about whether or not they have these kinds of problems. And because of the stigma associated with these problems, many people might not want to participate in such research. So the information I will give you now about how common the situation is has to be taken with that sort of grain of salt, that understanding that the research is not perfect. Nevertheless, it seems that if we look at men under the age of 40, this problem might affect 40 to 50% of those men at least one time during their life up until the age of 40. Okay. Typically, it's not chronic at that time, in part because of the physical health of people under 40. Typically, it is not compromised in such a way that medical issues would be, physical medicine would not be affecting erectile dysfunction. That's more of a problem when people get older. Okay. But nevertheless, despite that, our best estimate is that perhaps 40 or 50% of men under 40 years of age have had that problem at least once in their life. And maybe 2 to 5% have that problem chronically. That is, it's a regular feature of their lives. If we look at men over the age of 70, about 70% is the best estimate of men who have this problem at least once. And again, for those, a larger percentage than for the younger group have it chronically. It may be as high as 15 or 20%. Okay, so there's definitely a relationship between age and erectile dysfunction, but erectile dysfunction can occur at any age, and very often it happens to men when they first have or try to have sexual intercourse, and that's because they're very nervous and they don't know quite what they're doing, and nervousness and anxiety, as we will see, plays a huge role in the problem of erectile dysfunction. Okay. And it's very important for me to mention at this point, before we talk about the 7, or actually I'll mention an 8th, common psychological causes for erectile dysfunction, it's important to make a distinction between what I would call primary erectile dysfunction and secondary erectile dysfunction. Primary erectile dysfunction really can be caused by many, many different things. It can be caused by physical problems. It can be caused by the side effects of medication. It can be caused by the kinds of psychological issues that we're going to be outlining today. But once a problem like this has arisen, because it's a very disturbing problem to men, it creates anxiety that if they attempt to get an erection and have, let's say, sexual intercourse, it could happen again. And so we have another concept, which I'll call secondary erectile dysfunction. And that secondary erectile dysfunction can be completely independent of whatever the primary erectile dysfunction was caused by. And basically the secondary erectile dysfunction is caused by anxiety, is caused by the anticipation that one is going to have this problem again. And if you look at any area where people engage in activity that they're anxious about, we know it affects performance. So for example, if one is asked to engage in a public speech, some people feel very confident in public speaking, and some people feel very nervous about it. They don't feel they'll be adequate. And their anxiety itself is likely to produce precisely what they fear, the failure to be able to speak adequately in public. So we know that anxiety plays a huge role. And once a man has experienced erectile dysfunction once, probably the major reason why it may continue for them, unless it's a purely medical issue, is their anxiety, the anticipatory anxiety that they feel that this is going to happen again. That's a very, very important thing to know. And of course, for men having their first sexual experience, the anxiety, what I've just called secondary erectile dysfunction, really can affect them the first time. The anxiety, am I going to be able to perform? Is my partner going to enjoy it? All of these things can have a very negative effect upon one's functioning. So that's a very important point then to keep in mind. And that if you think something is going to go wrong, there's a much greater chance that it will go wrong, because anxiety produces things going wrong, than if you attribute any failure, in this case to get an erection, at time 1, to just circumstances that will not necessarily occur in time 2. The more confident people are, basically, the less likely the problem is going to repeat itself. Okay. Now, I'm going to mention to you 7, but really 8. I'll add one additional one on. Common causes of erectile dysfunction. Common psychological causes. We've already talked about some of the medical conditions that might be operating in this particular situation. Okay. The first one is one's general stress level. Okay. Life is stressful for many people. And there probably is nobody on earth that doesn't feel a great deal of psychological stress at some point in their life. And stress can come from many sources. They could be worried about their health. They could be worried about their job. They could be worried about the economy in general. They could be worried about natural disasters. They could be worried about the political situation. They could worry about the possibility that war is going to come. There are many, many things that people can worry about. And when you are preoccupied with one set of worries in your life, it's very difficult to distract yourself and devote yourself to a pleasurable activity. The stress of these other concerns intrude upon you. You can't quite get them out of your mind. And as a result of that, even if you think you're motivated to engage in sexual activity, these distractions might actually make it difficult to get an erection. Okay, so that's the first possible psychological cause. The second one is also a matter of stress, but in this case it's not something like your job or your family's well-being, your children's problems, the political situation in your country, the whether there may be a war or not, your general health. In this case, the stress has to do very specifically with the relationship you have with the person you're going to be having sex with, your spouse. Couples go through many different kinds of periods in the course of a marriage, and sometimes everything is working very well for them as a couple. They're happy, they enjoy each other's company, but sometimes they get into very serious conflicts with each other. They're very angry with each other, and engaging in sexual activity, if they try to engage in sexual activity when they have very, very negative feelings towards their partner, this also can undercut to a significant extent whether they will be able to perform adequately, because their anger may still be very close to the surface, and sexual activity is supposed to involve mutual pleasure and expression of love, and when you're not feeling that towards your partner, it can have this kind of effect. Okay. That's not to say that you can't have what's called make-up sex, which is Sex sometimes can bring people closer together when they are fighting with each other. But I'm just saying it's it can go either way. It can have a negative effect at times as well. And by the way, since we're focusing on erectile dysfunction, which is a problem that only exists for men, because only men have penises, nevertheless, I think it's important for me to say that all of the factors that I am talking about that impact on men and their ability to have erections and sustain erections that are firm, all of these factors can also impact on the partners of men. Women don't get erections, but they need to have physiological changes going on in order for them to have sexual intercourse. They have to be aroused. They have to be lubricated in some way. And when they're aroused naturally, this occurs. Otherwise, sexual intercourse can be very painful, and people tend to avoid things that are painful. And so there's an equivalent for women of all of the issues that can affect men psychologically can affect women as well. If a woman is very angry at her husband, it can have a similar kind of effect on their sexual life as when a man is very angry with his wife. A third factor that can operate for people is what we call depression. And depression is something quite different from, oh, you feel bad because your national team lost a game, or the local football team that you root for lost a game, or just something went wrong, some situation didn't turn out the way you expected it to. Depression is something much deeper than that. It's a psychological state that involves a sense of hopelessness, the belief that your life is always going to be miserable, you will never be happy. And one of the consequences, one of the symptoms of depression in a clinical sense, people who are suffering from clinical depression, is what's called anhedonia, A-N-H-E-D-O-N-I-A. And what that means is a lack of interest in having pleasure. If you are suffering from depression in a clinical sense, the things that you used to love, you have no interest in indulging in any longer. You used to like to watch sports. You just have lost interest. You used to love good food, but you're not hungry. You don't want to eat anymore. There were television programs that you enjoyed a lot. You have no interest. And that, of course, can apply to sex as well. You just have very little interest in engaging in sex, but sometimes people are in a relationship are expected or feel they're expected to engage in sexual activity even though they don't want to. And if one is a depressed person and one feels obligated to engage in sexual activity but one doesn't really want to, that's another thing that could possibly cause erectile dysfunction. Okay. Number 4, low self-esteem. People have varying conceptions of themselves and their own worth. And it's not entirely clear where this comes from. And once people develop if people develop low self-esteem, that is a low regard for their own worth as a human being, it can be very difficult to change that, because one of the peculiarities of low self-esteem is it doesn't seem to really have a great deal of relationship to what people actually accomplish in life. There are people who, from an outsider's point of view, would seem to be incredibly successful, incredibly accomplished, and yet in their own minds they view themselves as failures. Okay? And then there are other people who are not particularly successful but just don't have this view of themselves at all. But the point here, for the purpose of analyzing the causes of erectile dysfunction, is that if you have very, very low self-worth, usually that means you also can't imagine that another person would really want to engage in sexual activity with you, because you're somebody who just has really no value as a human being. And if you carry that mindset into sexual activity, then you also run the risk of having erectile dysfunction. You feel the other person shouldn't want to have sex with you, doesn't really want to have sex with you, is pretending to want to have sex with you, feels obligated to have sex with you. It's not something they really want or even should want given your low self-image. And so if you feel that you're unworthy, if you feel that your partner is just pretending to want to have sex with you, it can also affect your ability to get a firm erection that you can sustain for a sufficient period of time. The fifth common cause, and it's somewhat, although not entirely related to the previous one, low self-esteem, is poor body image. Okay, there are people who may think very highly of themselves in certain aspects of life. They may think they're brilliant, they may think they're a great businessman, but they look in the mirror and they don't like what they see. They don't like their facial features, or they step on a scale and weigh themselves and they don't like the number that comes up. And as a result of that, they also feel that their partner really couldn't possibly want to have sex with them. Maybe their partner loves them, maybe their partner loves them for other qualities they have, but if their partner was truly honest, their partner would not want to have sex with them. Now, again, this is something that women can be affected by as well in terms of their self-image, and because so much emphasis in many societies, not all societies, but many societies, is placed on women's appearance. Probably women are more afflicted with this particular problem than men. They think they weigh too much, they think certain body parts aren't attractive, their skin isn't attractive, whatever. And it may make them want to avoid sexual activity or feel that their partner really, really doesn't want to have sex with them. They're just doing the right thing or doing what they feel obligated to do. Okay, so I'm just saying women can be affected, probably more so than men, by this, but women don't get erections, and therefore what we're talking about here is the effect on men. So again, if you have a bad body image, if you don't think you're attractive, you don't think you're going to be attractive to another person, you think a person who indicates they want to have sex with you or is willing to have sex with you really wouldn't want to do that. It can also affect your confidence and your ability to be aroused yourself. And I should mention one little subset of body image, because I've certainly had clients with this kind of problem. Many men have a belief that their penis is too small and that somehow or other they will not be able to satisfy their partner, or they won't be able to perform adequately, or their partner really doesn't want to have sex with them for this reason. A huge proportion of these men, actually, the problem exists only in their head. Okay, they have a false perception of what is necessary, what is common, what is normal in size. But there's no doubt that many men feel inadequate because of this, whether they should or not. And as a consequence, this self-consciousness and the anxiety, and again, anxiety is the key here, may make it difficult for them to have erections and sustain an erection long enough to engage in sexual activity. Okay. A sixth psychological factor, although it's really, it's not quite the same kind of psychological factor as the others, would be insomnia. Probably everybody at some point in their life goes through periods where they just don't sleep well. They're sleep deprived. It could be psychological stress is acting on them. It could be many, many different things. But the fact of the matter is, if one is suffering from insomnia for any length of time, you're going to have very little energy, and you may not be really able to perform sexually as you would when you are well rested. So that's something to keep in mind. And by the way, I mean, running through all of these, I should say, is that people should only have sex when they feel they want to and are capable of doing it. Okay, because if someone feels like, oh, I'm exhausted, I'm tired, but my wife wants me to have sex and so I should, you're more likely to have this kind of a problem. I'm not saying you necessarily will, but there's more of a likelihood than if you're well rested. And again, I'll reiterate because it's very important, we have that old problem of secondary erectile dysfunction. Whatever may cause it the first time, and let's say sleep deprivation does, after that, you're going to start thinking, oh, it didn't work out before, I hope it doesn't, I don't have the same problem, even if they're well rested. Okay, so that's why one should never engage in that kind of activity unless one feels like doing so. Okay, so insomnia. The seventh is something that I think we have to acknowledge also as a factor. It's a very, very difficult factor to address, but that is we lose attraction for our partner in some way. Either physically, there's some kind of change in their appearance in a manner which makes them unattractive to you when previously they were very attractive to you. Sometimes this is an issue that one can address, but not always. And sometimes the lack of attraction is not physical, but psychological. And I'm not talking about the situation where you're fighting and you're angry, but again, just like we can relate stress about a particular thing that happens and compare it to depression, which is a global feeling that your life is hopeless and meaningless and you can't get pleasure out of anything you do. We find the same thing here. There's a difference between being angry at a spouse, which may have an impact on sexual performance, and a much deeper kind of alienation from one's spouse. okay, no longer loving for them, no longer loving them, no longer caring about them, just not being comfortable in their presence. And of course, this can have many, many, many different sources. But again, if one is going to engage in sexual activity with somebody where you have those kinds of feelings, it's certainly going to increase the likelihood that you might have an erection problem because you're just really not into this person at all in any way whatsoever. Okay, initially this was headlined as 7 causes, but between the time I submitted the title and now, I thought of an 8th one, and this is something that is relatively rare, but nevertheless worth mentioning. I mean, sometimes people can avoid sexual activity. Sometimes you can have erectile dysfunction because you're afraid of getting someone pregnant. You don't want to get them pregnant. Maybe you have already many children, but you don't enjoy using birth control. So you're sort of ambivalent about having sex. So that can be a fear of impregnating your spouse. And then there's another kind of fear, and that is a fear of causing some kind of pain. I mentioned earlier that although women don't have penises and can't have an erectile dysfunction, women can have other sexual problems. And a very common one is lack of lubrication. When women are younger in particular, they can lubricate pretty naturally if they're aroused. But as they get older, particularly after menopause, it becomes more difficult. There are ways of addressing this. But in any case, sexual intercourse under these circumstances can become very painful. And if a husband is sensitive to the fact that their wife might experience some pain with intercourse, that fear, that anxiety about causing pain might also play a role in making one ambivalent about having sexual intercourse, and that could possibly also have an effect on whether one is able to have an erection and sustain it. Okay, so these are, I've given you an overview of the problem of erectile dysfunction, talked about how common it is, talked about both the medical sources of it, but concentrated mainly on the 8 most common psychological causes, and at this point I'd be happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Okay, so thanks Dr. Milton for the insightful talk. I will now go through a few questions that we got from our participants, our audience. So the first one, from your talk I realized that sometimes I have secondary ED. What can I do to avoid it?
Well, I think the most important thing to understand is that for most people, except those who are suffering from some serious medical condition and have to be, and very often the two are connected, have to be on some kind of medication that itself might cause erectile dysfunction. For the most part, the factors that enter into having the experience the first time are ephemeral. They come, they go. As I said, a huge proportion of men will have this problem every once in a while because of one of the circumstances that I mentioned, and maybe others that I hadn't thought of. Okay, and we'll think of after this webinar is over and say, oh, why didn't I think of that one too? And so I think the most important thing you can do is to forget the previous experiences. Okay, unless you can identify them as coming from one of the causes, and you can address one of those causes, address that particular cause, and do something about it. But I think the going into a sexual experience thinking, am I going to fail? Am I going to fail? Is this going to be like the last time? There's just a very high likelihood that it's going to happen. And so I think you have to sort of, if you possibly can, throw that previous experience out the window, say, oh, it was just, just by chance, by accident, it just was due to something that really doesn't have any significance in terms of, any future attempt. I think you'll have a much better chance of being able to handle that problem. There are treatments that one can take, and I'm sure all of you have heard about Viagra or Cialis, and there's another one too, that can sort of help people with this problem by sort of making it easier for them to have erections if they have desire, and then they can, once, it's like riding a bicycle. If you fall off the bicycle, then you do it, it suddenly works. At that point, you almost can't fall off a bicycle again. So these medications, which are really now the first-line treatment, as long as there's arousal, they basically help people get erections. And again, once you get one, eventually you can, maybe even after one time, you can no longer need it. It's a little like, I guess, in the U.S., when you learned how to ride a bicycle, they'd have things called training wheels. So it'd really be these two little additional wheels, and it would give the kid confidence on the bicycle, and then at some point those training wheels could come off, and you just have the two regular wheels. So I think throwing out the past in your own mind and saying, well, this was just something that happened, it doesn't have any particular predictive value on the next time. If you can do that, that will go a very long way. Because again, most, if not most, close to most men will have this on occasion, okay? And they tend to overreact, particularly the first time, because it's so shocking to them. Yeah, I was just to say that when someone has a particular issue, it's best to speak to a professional, because the particular circumstance they have needs to be analyzed in terms of what they can do. When I mentioned these medications, they're things that are used very widely because they can handle many different causes which produce the same result. But if somebody has a problem, they really need to discuss the particular features. And some people have very, very unusual particular features that really can only be addressed when you talk to a professional, and you can get advice that's very specific to your own situation.
I have a question related to Viagra. There's a question here. Can Viagra cure psychological issues by bringing confidence levels up?
Well, Viagra does one thing. Viagra will make it possible for someone who is unable to get an erection and has desire and does not have a kind of medical condition which would make it virtually impossible to achieve an erection. They're not going to make somebody desire someone they don't desire. But if desire is there, they can produce an erection. Now, if one's lack of confidence and negative feelings about themselves are very tied to erectile dysfunction, there's no question that being able to perform sexually is going to make people feel more confident and better about themselves in general. And as I just said in answer to the previous question, once you have success, even though it may come from a pill, it's still success, and it makes it easier to have success without a pill in the future. You know, people can start at a certain level of dosage. If it works at that dosage, they can reduce the dosage and eventually not use any pill. Also, the different pills might, some of there are three different brands, Vialis and Levitra, and all of them are similar but slightly different, and there's some evidence that one particular one, I forget which, but you know, it can be looked up. One particular one might be a little more useful for younger men. One might be a little more useful for older men. Some Viagra, you have a 4-hour window within which you can use it after you take it, and Cialis, there's a 24-hour window, so there's less pressure to, they're perfectly healthy for people, except for people who have certain medical conditions and are on certain medications. People who are on, who have angina and are on nitroglycerin, it is definitely not recommended. But, you know, this would be something you would discuss with your doctor. Okay, next question.
Okay, the next question. Yeah, I'm 35 years old. I always lose my erections very easily. I'm a slim guy, often tired, and I usually have very cold hands. Is this related to hormones, or is it a mental thing?
Well, you know, I think first of all you should get a physical exam to see if, you know, you have some, you know, there's some physical condition. You might also get your testosterone levels checked because, and this is something I didn't mention before as part of medical reasons, but there can be a variety of reasons why people have low testosterone. It could be a medical condition. It's something that can be addressed with booster shots of testosterone, but men need a certain level. You don't need a huge amount of testosterone to be able to have an erection, but you need a minimal amount. And so I would say the first thing you should do is to make sure that there isn't any physical issue. And to only once that's checked out, and if it turns out there is no physical issue, there isn't an issue of a particular disease or condition, and your testosterone levels are fine, well then you can get into the question of the psychology, but you would need to really discuss the very specific particulars of your life and under what circumstances you've tried to get erections, what's happened exactly. In other words, you can't give general advice is general advice. Everybody's situation is slightly different, and so I think you should get checked out by a physician, and if there's still a problem, then I think talking to a psychologist who knows something about this issue would be very important. Not necessarily a physician, but a psychologist who specializes in this.
Okay. The next one. How does consuming pornography contribute to the problem?
Okay. It does not. That's the simple answer. Okay. There is a belief that has developed, particularly in Western societies, I should say. I know it's sort of developed in the United States, that men are watching a great deal of pornography on the internet, and as a result of that, they have images of women that are unrealistic in terms of what normal women look like, and they cannot get aroused by normal women, only by only by the imaginary women or the webcam women. Okay. Now, I should say that there is absolutely no scientific evidence that this is true. Absolutely no scientific evidence. No one has ever done research to see if this is true. So the belief that this is true is just based on anecdotes, stories, claims. Now, I will amend what I just said. If you're watching pornography and you're masturbating a great deal, we run into the problem of what's called the refractory period. The refractory period is the time between you have an orgasm, you ejaculate, have an orgasm, and your ability to have your next erection. So if somebody watches pornography and engages in masturbation and then wants to engage in sexual activity with a real person, an hour later, they may not be able to do it. So there is this indirect relationship, but it's really got nothing to do with pornography itself. This notion about pornography, it's really very similar to a lot of other views about things that have existed. So, for example, movies. If people see a beautiful actress on a movie screen, they will be unsatisfied with normal women who don't look like beautiful movie actresses. Okay, but that's not true. Okay, there's no evidence for that. So there are lots of things where people come up with an idea that seems to make sense superficially, but in reality makes no sense whatsoever. And again, I can only reiterate, absolutely no scientific evidence that this is true. There is a website called Medscape where you can have access to literally thousands of medical journals across the world, and you can put in keywords, and you can see what is known about research on a particular disease, whether a particular treatment is effective or not. It's a great site. And I put in terms pornography and erectile dysfunction, and absolutely nothing came out, which meant that there's not a single study in the entire world published in any medical journal that addresses this issue. So anybody who tells you there's a relationship between watching pornography and erectile dysfunction, they're telling you something that is a myth.